Oh yeah, baby. It's Saturday. And it's time to make the donuts. And donuts is what I'm going to be doing in the form of editing a brand new episode of this bad boy. My Nonfiction Brand podcast comes out every single Monday, and because I'm a procrastinator, I edit it on the Saturday or the Sunday before the Monday in order to have the podcast up and ready for release at 3 a.m. Eastern Time here in the United States of America on Monday, whatever that Monday happens to be. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to be working on a Nonfiction Brand podcast episode from raw record that I've gotten from Ecamm Live's interview mode, and then I'm going to plug it into GarageBand and do what I do to make the podcast sound as good as it possibly can. So let's get started with that right away. First off, I'm going to open up an already existing project. I'll get my head out of the way. Just hit that, because what I do is I take an old episode and then save it as a folder full of, come on, baby, where are you? Go. I save it as a folder and rename it, because all my settings for my voice and everything else are pretty well figured out. So I kind of roll over my settings from one session to another simply by taking the old session, copying it or cloning it, changing the titles, and then start out what I'm doing now, which is cleaning out the old stuff and putting in the new stuff. So this episode right here, episode 190 with Jason Sircone, that's what I'm going to be doing today. So Jason, you've been asking, when's the podcast coming out? The answer is this coming Monday. And that'll be the first of 2 episodes that Jason Sircone will be in, because that's the way my podcast rolls, which is I have people on one Monday, and then the subsequent Monday, I also have them on. So it's a twofer for my guests. They get real value being on my podcast because they're on it twice within 2 weeks period. So here's the last episode that I cut, and this is episode 189 that you see right here, and all the edits I made. Yeah, there were a bunch, because I care. Frankly, because I care. But I'm going to get rid of all this stuff because this is a whole brand new clean episode. And what I need to do is get new material in here. Hold on. And I'll do it this way. I've got all my original podcast records in the original podcast sessions. And you can see in here that I've got Jason Sircone's session right here. Okay, so, this was back when, okay, let me talk about this a little bit. As usual, as I progress my podcast moving forward into its 4th year of production, I'll occasionally change things, try to make them better, try to upgrade the quality of the sound and stuff like that. And so I've been trying different stuff to see how it works, how I can make it better. And in this case, I've got the actual audio from a Restream.io session that I'll be using as the base audio. So I'm not, I said earlier, I'm using Ecamm Live's interview mode. In this case, I'm not, because I had not at that time started using Ecamm Live's interview mode. I love interview mode because it allows you to actually have separate split tracks between my voice, guest voice, and then I can put separate EQ on each of the tracks and make everybody sound great. In this case, I've got only one kind of track here, an M4A, and I'm going to drag this into good old GarageBand, and I'm going to put it at the 0.0. I'm literally button it up against the wall so that I know where the track is actually starting. And you can see right there, it is literally thinking its way through the entire thing so that the entire 1 hour recording session shows up. And it's doing it, and it's all there, so I'm happy. I'm just going to make sure at the end that I did, in fact, get all of this in here. I'm extending the end of this. Okay, so literally just over an hour and change of recording. I know that this is a 2 half-hour-ish episodes, so I'm just going to do some listening here and see if I can figure out where one episode begins, the other stops. So I'm going to start by going to 30 minutes in and just figure out where we are.
Given you're going to be a lot more successful. So your original question, DP, I feel like I've ventured off and I was able to topic that you can remain passionate about content.
All right, so this is all, it's very hard for me to find the end of the episode. I'm not going to waste a lot of time doing that. Instead, I'm going to go right to the beginning here. I'm going to mute out a couple of tracks that I don't need right now, the music bed and the room tone track. Room tone, I'll talk about later, but for now, let's try to figure out where this thing actually starts. I'm going to extend this out. And I'm going to listen. Well, you know what time that is. A special time of day, and that is for the latest, in my not so humble opinion, what's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition to that very special guest in just a second. But I do want to say that the key thing to take away from this conversation today, I mean, there are going to be a ton of takeaways, believe me. But one of the big ones is podcasting is not just a good, actually another live, well, what's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition recording session of the Nonfiction Brand podcast with a very special guest. And I want to introduce you to that very special guest in just a second, but let's see, where can I cut this in? In my not so humble opinion, where I get to share my point of view about just about anything I feel like talking about. Well, what's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another in my not so humble opinion. Let's see if I can join it later. The key thing to take away from this conversation today, I mean, there are going to be a ton of takeaways, believe me. But one of the big ones is podcasting is not just a good strategy for people who podcast themselves. All right, so share my point of view about just about anything I feel like talking about. I don't want the music in there, so I want to find a clip area where it doesn't have music under it, because I don't want to double my music. You'll see what I mean in a second. Well, what's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition recording session of the Nonfiction Brand podcast with I could probably go, what's today's talking about? Talking about? Well, what's today's? All right, let's just play around with this a little bit. I'm going to highlight my track, hit Command T for trim, and get rid of that crap. And then pull this all the way to around 2 seconds, because I know that's about as much intro music as I want to have. I don't like extended intros, or for my podcast, I don't want an extended intro. So instead, I will just do it like this. All right. Well, what's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition recording session of what's today's? Well, I got a well. I want to get rid of that well. So instead, does this make sense? Come on. Sometimes the drag and drop is a little bit wonky. What's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition recording session of the Nonfiction Brand podcast. It's actually another live. It's actually another. We got another well in there, so let's see if this works. Get rid of the well. I don't know if I'll like this, but I'm going to try it. It's actually another live edition recording session of the Nonfiction Brand podcast with a very special guest. And I want to introduce you to that very special. It's an actual, well, I wish it was welcome to another but we're going to go with what we got, maybe. It's actually another live edition. Might leave that well. Well, it's actually another live. Might have to pull in some of this stuff. Actually, another talking about. Well, what's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another. What's today's talking about? What's today's? All right, let's do that. What's today's talking about? What? What's today's talking about? Well, it's what's today's talking about? What's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another. All right. I heard a big breath in here, right here. So I'm going to go to controls here, smart controls. All right, so my noise gate. Okay, by simply dropping it to 28 minus 28. Let me get my head out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. All right, so right now it's just looping, trying to hear that. So listen. I don't want that. But I also don't want to. Minus 29 decibels. You can still hear it. Minus 27, you can't. And then minus 28. I want it as least less sensitive as possible, but I do want to get rid of obnoxious breaths. So let's listen from here. What's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition. All right, so let me get rid of the music bed just so I can hear this cleanly. Talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition. Okay, we got a in here. It's another live edition. So Command T, highlight where you want it, and then butt it together. And remember, editing is mostly about taking stuff out. Live edition. So let's listen. What's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition. Actually another live edition. Well, it's actually another live edition recording session of the Nonfiction Brand podcast with a very special guest. And I want to. All right, so before I go any further, I want to check my audio levels here because you could hear right. Why is it going up and then down like that? I should have cleaned out my levels so you can see right here. I don't want to do that. Just want to get rid of those guys and then make sure that this is right about 0 or unity. And why this doesn't make it easy to get to unity, I will never know, but it's one of those Apple quirks. So I get it. Oh, right there, close to 0. And then I want to do this to get rid of all this nonsense from last week's. I want to start out with an even track. And we're going to start out here at 0. Oh, I got 0. Yay. What a fantastic day. We got music in here. Let me just focus. So I want to allow the earlier parts of the track to be a little bit louder. You can see kind of following the fade on the music. So let's listen. What's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition recording session of the Nonfiction Brand podcast with a very special guest. And I want to introduce you to that very special guest in just a sec. Okay, I'm going to put 2 dots in there so that I can kind of just make a plateau for the opening part with a little bit of a ramp. What's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition recording session of the Nonfiction Brand podcast with a very special guest. And I want to introduce you to that very special guest in just a second. But I do want to say that let's actually extend. No, I want to extend this outward all the way to the end of the music. So again, if I get rid of that dot, if I highlight that dot, delete it, I'll now get kind of a plateau and then a fade out with the music till I get my voice level down to 0. With a very special guest. 0 dB. I want to introduce you to that very special guest in just a second, but I do want to say that the key thing to take away from this conversation today, Okay, so that hiccup, that highlight the track, Command T, pull it back, butt it together. And again, this is using GarageBand. So it doesn't have all the automation tools that you'd like it to have, but it has 90+% of them. And it's free, which is the big thing to take away from this conversation today. There are going to be a ton of takeaways, believe me. There are going to be a ton of takeaways, believe me. But one of the big ones is podcasting is not just a good strategy for people who podcast themselves, host their own podcast, but it's a really great strategy for people who want to guest on podcasts. But perhaps what a lot of potential guests don't know, they don't know. Well, my guest today is here to tell us all about. Well is one of my tells. Get rid of every well that's possible because it's one of my spacer words. Everybody has spacer words that they use all the time. Well, so, are very common spacer words, and they're used for filling in the air when you want to think about something. Good podcasters are not afraid of a little bit of dead air. That's an example right there. It allows what you said before the dead air to stand out a little bit more. But bad podcasters or bad guests go, and they feel they have to fill every segment of the podcast record with noise. And frankly, you don't. A little bit of space, a little bit of air allows your audience to process what you've just said and really engage with the podcast. If it's everything too close together, there's not enough time for your audience, literally the buffer in their head, to process through everything you've said. So you want to have some space in there, and you also want to get rid of spacer or filler words that don't add any valuable content to the podcast. I'll be doing that a lot as I edit this podcast, and you'll see. All right, back to the show. A lot of potential guests don't know. They don't know. My guest today is here to tell us all about that, and I want to introduce you to him right now. In fact, I met Jason Sircone by being on his podcast, and we had a great conversation about the value of podcasting, kind of, just like everybody else, talking about how it's a great multiplier for personal brands who really want to get themselves out there. Multiplier? Talking about how it's a great multiplier for. So multiplier starts a multiplier. So I can get a great multiplier. If I get rid of this to right about there, bring those together, what does it sound like? It's like everybody else, talking about how it's a great multiplier for personal brands who really want to get themselves out there. And when we started talking, and I was kind of talking as a host of a podcast, all right, so that was weird. Personal brands who really want to get themselves out there. And when we started talking, And when we started talking, I was kind of talking from the, as a host of a podcast, it's a great way for me to get my personal brand out there. But as we talked, it became pretty apparent to me that what you were coming, or the point of view you were coming from, what you were coming, or the point of view you were. Let's see, that's a mess. It became pretty apparent to me that what you were coming, or the point of view you were coming from was, yeah, but it's a really tremendous way for people who may not have the time, talent, or ability to podcast. That doesn't mean you can't be on podcasts if you have the right strategy. And that's why I'm so happy to be talking to Jason Sircone today, because he is actually the dude to talk to if you want to know how to put podcasting in your personal brand embellishment, leveraging strategy, even if you don't have a podcast. Embellishment, I don't like. I'm going to get rid of that. Personal brand embellishment, leverage. And this is a great place for me to say what I always say. If it is discrete, you can delete, because there's space before and after. I can get rid of that completely simply by Command T, and butt it up together, and no one will know it was ever there. In your personal brand leveraging strategy, even if you don't have a podcast. Am I telling the truth about kind of who you are, what you do, and how you do it? Truth about, not kinda, get rid of the kinda, about. And again, I've got a space right after it, so I can just get it closer like this. Am I telling the truth about who you are, what you do, and how you do it, Jason?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
That Jason was a little odd, so I'm going to cut that out. All right, now this is Jason coming in. I'm putting him on a separate track because I may be adjusting his EQ. We'll listen. Truth about who you are, what you do, and how you do it?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
I think he sounds pretty good. He has a good mic setup, so that really, really helps. About who you are, what you do, and how you do it?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate, DP.
Give it a little bit more space. About who you are, what you do, and how you do it?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate, DP. I mean, it is one of the common misconceptions with the podcasting space is that you have to have a show to maximize your time. And I'm here to tell you today that is not the case. And
all right, before we go too far, I want to check his track's noise gate and see where it exists. It's at -42, which is not very sensitive. But let's listen to see if we hear any weird or too much breath noise. Because here's the challenge with dealing with breath noise. A lot of times you won't hear, but you will hear. So you want to be able to cut out the without cutting out the beginning of a word like snake. That S leads into snake, or how. There's a little bit of a breathy into how. If you have a noise gate that's too sensitive, it'll go ow without the how, or the nake without the snake. So it's a balancing act. I want to take out the breath, but I don't want to lose the sibilant sounds of s. I might lose some of it, but there has to be at least a little bit of an S before nake to make it sound like snake. Make sense? Hopefully it will as we go along. So here we go. Let's see. So far he's sounding okay. So I do want to check what his EQ is. I've got it set at Dawn Warm, which is one of my settings. But let's see what I'm set at. I don't always. Sometimes I change it. Vintage Vocal. Vintage Vocal is a preset that works really well with men because, and it's got a little bit of a high cut, because it gives you a little bit of lower baritone or upper baritone richness, so it makes men sound better.
And I'm here to tell you today that is not the case. And I think one of the more disturbing statistics that surrounds podcasts.
Okay, he's got a fair amount of in his voice, so I'm going to keep it on the high cut because you can see right down here, this cuts out some of the higher frequency stuff, the really crunchy high end. You have to have some of that because that helps with articulation of words. But too much, and it's I don't want all that. So that's why I'm doing vintage vocal with a high cut. Let's look at vintage vocal the way it is as a preset in GarageBand. Now just watch the change in the EQ there. Boom. This is it with all that crunchy stuff.
Or disturbing statistics that surrounds podcasts. And I'll tell you, I actually just looked this up last night from when we...
You hear a lot of S. Now let's hear it vintage vocal with a little bit of a high cut.
That surrounds podcasts. And I'll tell you, I actually just looked this up last night from the day that we're recording. It is something like 4.5 million registered podcasts.
Okay. I think I'm going to leave it like that because taking down the S a little bit, that's going to help because as I go through the process and turn it into an MP3 and stuff like that, it tends to accentuate a lot of the high-end stuff. So knocking it down a little bit just helps it not be too SC, not too high frequency. So I'm going to leave this right here. Let's go back to listening to what Jason was saying.
That surrounds podcasts. And I'll tell you, I actually just looked this up last night from the day that we're recording. Last night from when we were...
Okay. Just looked it up last night. From the day that we're recording.
With the podcasting space is that you have to have a show to maximize your time. And I'm here to tell you today that is not the case. And I think one of the more disturbing statistics that surrounds podcasts, and I'll tell you, I actually just looked this up last night from the day that we're recording. It is something like 4.5 million registered podcasts right now, which is, that number blew my mind because the last I had heard it was just a little over 2.5. So I only referenced one article.
So the get rid of the so I only reference.
So I only referenced one article. Don't know how true that is, but the more disturbing part of that statistic was that like a fraction of that, something around like 1 million and change, were still producing their own shows. They're still producing new shows.
Okay, there was a hiccup in there. They're alone.
We're still producing their own shows. They're still producing.
Okay, so this is a aberration from the recording. Let's see what happens if I just that
shows. They're still producing.
Let's see if it sounds better.
We're still producing their own shows. They're still producing.
All right, you can see there's still a little gap in there. If I can butt these up.
Producing their own shows. They're still producing.
Okay, so there's a little bit of a hiccup in there, but when I compress this, it'll iron it out a little bit.
We're still producing their own shows. They're still producing new shows and new content. And the industry term for that is pod fading, meaning the podcast launched and then it faded away. And I think that one of the big reasons for that is that people start podcasts not really knowing and understanding how much work is involved with building a podcast. And DP, you can testify as much as I can. We are both podcasters. We know how much work goes into this. So for people that want to be a part of this world and
okay, I'm going to leave in some of these gaps in here because it allows the podcast to air out. I used to be really, really militant about cutting things in, even using a thing called truncate audio, which is you take the gaps and make them shorter. And sometimes that's okay, but I have had guests who are very kind of laconic in their answers. Like, you ask a question at this tempo, and they have this big pause before they come in. And because every single answer has this big pause, you're like, that's just too much. So I go in, use truncate, which is a setting in Audacity, another program I use in preparing my podcast, and it literally goes through and finds everything this length and make it this length. Make it 60%. Like if it's this wide gap, boom, make it shorter. Just tighten it up, and I can get back over a 30-minute podcast 2 minutes of gaps of dead air. That's when you know you've got a guest who really takes a lot of time. But Jason here is answering the questions really nicely, leaving some gaps, which is nice. It just allows the podcast to breathe. So I'm not going to be overly militant about getting rid of those. Instead, I'm going to let him have his own vocal style and his own vocal tempo and not mess a lot with that. His audio needs to retain the character of who he actually is, Jason Sircone. All right, back to the show.
Building a podcast. And DP, you can testify as much as I can. We are both podcasters. We know how much work goes into this. So for people that want to be a part of this world and be a part of podcasting, you don't have to have your own show to be effective. People like me, people like you, we're always looking to have interesting conversations, thoughtful conversations, and have that impact the audience that is listening to our show. In order to do that, we have to have great guests. So as a personal brand...
He uses the word "so" a lot as a filler word. The question is, it's a nice transition point word in some cases. So I am going to have to be very judicious in which ones I keep and which ones I get rid of. So I'm going to go back and listen and look for opportunities to remove some of the so's. So is like cilantro. A little bit in salsa is nice, but a cilantro salad that is nothing but cilantro might be a little too much. So let's get rid of the cilantro, or at least some of it. And that's how I think of it sometimes. It's like you're a chef and you get to decide just how salty or cilantro-y this piece is going to be.
For people that want to be a part of this world and be a part of podcasting, you don't have to have your own show to be effective.
Actually, that might be the pull quote right there. One of the things I do is have a pull quote from the episode for use in marketing the episode. So I'm just going to write down 318-750 as a note, because that might be a nice pull quote.
For people that want to be a part of this world and be a part of podcasting.
So I got an and I've been thinking about leaving the and in there, but
part of this world and be a part of.
He says and twice. I can get rid of one of them, so why don't I? Let's see if the pause works.
For people that want to be a part of this world and be a part of podcasting.
And be a part of podcasting.
People that want to be a part of this world and be a part of podcasting. You don't have to have your own show to be effective. People like me, people like you, we're always looking to have interesting conversations, thoughtful conversations, and have that impact. And have that impact.
Get rid of one of the ands because I think I can. I don't think I need to close this up. Let's listen.
Thoughtful conversations, and have that impact the audience that is listening to our show. In order to do that, we have to have great guests. So as a personal brand, as any type of personality that's looking to enhance your message, get it out to a wider audience, bring new people into your circle of influence, doing it via podcast guest marketing is the way to go.
That's a good endpoint for that audiogram. But he started at 318 and that's at 358. Geez, that's 40 seconds. That's too long. I need to start it later. Let's see, where could I pick this up? Let's say I start here.
So as a personal brand, as any type of personality.
So that might be a good place.
As a personal brand, as any type of personality that's looking to enhance your message, get it out to a wider audience, bring new people into your circle of influence. Doing it via podcast guest marketing is the way to go, because
All right, so that's 3:42. And it ends at, let's say, 3:58. Do a little math here. 16 seconds. That's not very long. Say 16.
and have that impact the audience that is listening to our show. In order to do that, we have to have great guests. So people like me, people like...
All right, so let's try it here. So this would be, call it 3:28. 3:28, and then it ends at 3:58. Can already tell that's very nice math-wise. 30 seconds. I think that'll be the clip. So it'll be 3:58 to 3:28 to 3:58. So let's listen to that just as a clip, as a pull quote.
People like me, people like you, we're always looking to have interesting conversations, thoughtful conversations, and have that impact the audience that is listening to our show. In order to do that, we have to have great guests. So as a personal brand, as any type of personality that's looking to enhance your message, get it out to a wider audience, bring new people into your circle of influence, doing it via podcast guest marketing is the way to go. Because
All right, so that's good. That's a 30-second clip. Yay, got that figured out. So let's just get back to editing this pup.
Because podcasts are incredibly popular. Before I finish this sentence, a new podcast will launch. There's so much going on in this space, and it's great to be a part of. But if you don't have the bandwidth in your day to produce a show, be a guest and make an impact that way.
Yeah, and I want to go back. Yeah, you can tell Jason's a podcaster because very few repetitive words, very few ums, very few obnoxious gaps or mispronunciations, stuff like that.
And make an impact that way.
Yeah, and I want to... That way got cut off.
Be a guest and make an impact that way.
Yeah, and I... Okay, this is interesting. Right here. Right here. If you... Okay, this is where I get on my hobby horse. A lot of people edit audio visually, and that's a huge mistake because what you see is different than what you can hear in the track. And so you'll often see me do this, close my eyes, tilt my head down, or something like this, because I'm literally turning off one set of sensors, my eyes, to focus all my brain's attention on this pair of sensors, my ears. And here's an excellent example of the reason why. If you look at this clip right here, that is the word why. And you can tell just by the volume that he's a little bit louder here, and then he's at kind of at the end of his lung capacity, and so the why comes out like this. Why. And why is one of those words that has a long tail on it. It starts out with a why. And that's literally how you should think of it is. It's a ramp in and a ramp out. If you are doing this visually, you'll go, oh, I can cut all the way to here. Let's listen to what that sounds like.
Be a guest and make an impact that way.
Yeah, and I want to... Yeah, see, I cut it, but look, there's just audio wave until that point, and then you go, oh, wait a minute. No, if you look closer, there's some little bit of crap here. I wonder if that makes a difference if I go like that. So I'm just going to solo my track for a second so you can really hear it.
And make an impact that way.
That way. Okay, it wasn't why, it was way. If I can make an impact that way.
And make an impact that way.
Okay, now I am not going to mess with the actual level. I'm not going to goose his level, which I could. I could go in here and actually boost him. I'm not going to do that because I know during the compression phase that I'll be doing later, that will take care of that. But the main thing I just want to impress upon you is that just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there when you listen. So favor your ears, not your eyes. Edit with your ears, not your eyes. Have I made my point? I think I have. All right. Let's back off on this. Hey, and by the way, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in. If you're watching, ask the questions. Hopefully I'll see the little response on screen. I don't mind interruptions. In fact, my squirrel brain appreciates them during the conversation or as I do this. So feel free to just type it in your comment box. And I should, fingers crossed, if everything is configured correctly, I'll be able to see your questions and answer them live via live stream. So if you have questions, ask.
If you don't have the bandwidth in your day to produce a show, be a guest and make an impact that way.
Yeah, and I want to... Okay, so I come in hot on a little too close, so I want what he said to linger a little bit. So I'm actually increasing the distance between his response and my response after it.
Your day to produce a show, be a guest and make an impact that way.
Yeah, and I want to go back.
Don't have the bandwidth in your day to produce a show, be a guest and make an impact that way.
Yeah, and I want to go back. This would be a good point to point out this. I mentioned room tone. If I get my head out of the way, you can see I have a whole track that is nothing but room tone. If we look at this closely, you will see that it is nothing but kind of a... Like if I were to solo this and play only this, but I will actually, I'm going to increase the level. Hold on, let me see what it was. I like it right at minus 33-ish. So this is what the room tone sounds like. What is room tone? It is the tone, surprise, surprise, of the room. And what this does is, if like I just did, if I'm talking and I pause to think and there's nothing there, it'll sound like talking, 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 nothing. Talking, 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 nothing. Talking, 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 nothing. With room tone, talking, 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 room tone. Talking, 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 room tone. So it's not this abrupt nothingness. It's what we're used to. It's like I'm talking, buffer, talking, not talking, boom. Talking, buffer, talking. Get it? It sounds so different, and you won't be able to tell unless you've got headphones on, but it makes all the difference in the world. And for years, I did not have room tone in my podcasts, and I would listen to them and go, they sound so choppy. They sound so talky, as opposed to talky. Room tone makes the difference. If you have questions about room tone, chime in. And by the way, this room tone clip I found online for free from, I guess, quicksounds.com. I use room tone ambience loop 4. Evidently, quicksounds.com has at least 3 other room tones, so you can match the tone of your room or your home or whatever sound you want. So you can certainly try that. All right, moving on. Enough about room tone. Unless you have questions, go ahead and ask them.
To produce a show, be a guest, and make an impact that way.
Yeah, and I want to go back and underline that figure you came out with right up at the top. 5 million podcasts plus or minus.
Right.
When I wrote my book, Nonfiction Brand, I actually looked it up, and that was about 1.5 years ago, and it was under 1 million. And then I looked it up again, maybe about 4 months ago, and it was 2.5 million. So the space is exploding hugely, as everyone knows, and especially if you like podcasts yourself, you know the value that podcasts bring. But what a lot of people, especially those newbies who are arriving in the podcast space, podcast space. Okay. This is me making myself sound smarter by getting rid of some hiccup I don't need to have there. Who are arriving in the podcast space. And this is why editing your own podcast makes you a better speaker, because, I don't want to do that again. I need to sound better. You can make yourself sound better and smarter because you're doing the editing yourself. Newbies who are arriving in the podcast space. Space. And again, this is a taste issue. Newbies who are arriving in the podcast space. So I can have a little bit of a gap there. Newbies who are arriving in the podcast space. You alluded to. It sounded like the pod. I don't think I've got a D in there, but let's see. Newbies who are arriving in the podcast space. That's you alluded to it. It takes time. I don't know about you and your podcast, but if you aggregate every episode's time when it comes to scheduling and editing and posting and following up and making sure you've got a certain amount of marketing going on. I took a breath there and I don't need it there, so I'm going to cut it out and just tighten it up. Editing and posting and following up and making sure you've got a certain amount of marketing going on social media, even if you're not paying for any of that stuff, it still takes time. I mean, I did the calculation for myself, and I'm going to say right. Still takes time. I mean, I did the calculation for myself, and it's for myself. Get rid of that weirdness because I think I can. And let's see how it sounds. I did the calculation for myself. It still takes time. I mean, I did the calculation for myself, and I'm going to say right around 10 hours a week for a weekly podcast. Now, if you're working a 40-hour job, that's 25% of your job on top of the full-time job I already have. So if you do the math, that's 25% of your job on top of the full-time job I already have. So if you do the math, I think there was kind of a, let's see what that is. Already have. So if you do the math, so it's the if. Let's see if there's some kind of weird. Have. So if you do the math, I think. So if. Job I already have. So if you do the math, I think there are a lot of people out there who'd like the benefit of podcasting without the, as you say, the kind of pain. Okay, there's, I think, something in here. I heard something. Let's see if I got rid of it. Podcasting without the, as you say, as you say, the kind of pain and maintenance of having a regular podcast. And again, that leads back right to you and your strategies about being a podcast guest. Now, when I started my podcast, Now, when I started my podcast, is what I want. Now, I can get rid of that stuff and make myself sound smarter. Isn't that a... When I started my podcast, if you're a control freak or a perfectionist or like me, a lazy perfectionist, I still want to sound decent. So I have control over how I sound. So I'm going to take that control and use it to make myself sound better. Podcast guest. Now, when I started my podcast, I'll be honest with everybody out there, I was very, very picky about who I had on because who I have on my podcast reflects directly on me and my abilities as a curator to bring to bring smart people who have great things to share and say on my podcast. But it frankly became harder and harder because I'll be honest with you, I don't know that many people. I'm on podcast number, this will probably go out in the 180s, so I don't know 180 people. And even though my podcast comes out twice a week, so you divide that by 2 and you get a more reasonable number, 90, I don't even know 90 people that are really that smart, that bring stuff to the table. So all of a sudden, I'm not... Okay, so I'm trying to put my thoughts together, but as an audience member, you don't have to wait for my thoughts to coalesce. Instead, I can tighten things up a little bit. And I can see these long gaps. Long gaps are fine sometimes, but again, you don't want too many of them. So let's see what this sounds like. Bring stuff to the table. So all of a sudden, I'm having a little problem getting the quality of guest. The knot doesn't work. I'm having a little trouble. So all of a sudden, I'm having a little problem getting the quality. I don't need that second I'm, so I can just overwrite it. Bing. Nice. Table. So all of a sudden, I'm having a little problem getting the quality of guest I wanted after I went through people. And, if you listen to this podcast, I went through people and, okay, so that's and if, let's see. After I went through people and if you listen to this podcast, I don't. After I went through people, if you listen to the... Okay, that didn't work. So I need the and. If you listen to this podcast. Okay, so if. So and if. Wanted after I went through people. And if you listen to this podcast, I'm not afraid to repeat people. And if you listen to this podcast, I'm not afraid to repeat. I'm not afraid to. Oops. Command Z is your friend. Undo. Don't be afraid if a move happens accidentally. Hit that Command Z. Command Z is our friend. Undo. Through people. And if you listen to this podcast, I'm not afraid to repeat people. If they're really great people on, like Jay Baer and Mark Schaefer, I'm having them on probably once every 6 months or maybe even a year or something like that. But at the same time, long gap. Months or maybe even a year or something like that. But at the same time, I want to bring new people to the fore. I want to bring people like you in front of my audience so they can learn something new. And when I met you on your podcast, I'm like, dude, I got to have you on. But I'll be honest with you, the way that we got to know each other was through, call it an online pod brokering service, if you will.
Podcasting tip.
Yeah, he comes in with podcasting too.
Podcasting Tinder, if you will.
Well, exactly. All right, so let me, just for clarity's sake, brokering service, if you will.
Podcasting Tinder.
Okay, so we had a little podcasting Tinder. To know each other was through, call it an online pod brokering service, if you will.
Podcasting Tinder, if you
Yeah,
will.
well, exactly. It's I swipe right on someone who you're matched with on a service called Podmatch. Now, I'm not a endorser or they don't pay me, but I get a ton of value out of Podmatch. So I'm not afraid to direct people out to podmatch.com all day long, whether you're a podcaster or a guest. But there are other services out there. But the point I want to make is, what point do I want to make? Podmatch just other services out there. But the point I want to make is Podmatch just, and this is the cool thing. You list what you're interested in, what you talk about, what you're expert in, and they find people who are looking for people who share a great amount of commonality. I think you and I matched at just under 70%.
Right.
And consequently, that caught my attention. For 70%.
Right.
So I'm going to take his right. This allows me to kind of be the conductor of my orchestra here and controlling the tempo of the podcast at just under 70%.
Right.
And consequently, that caught my attention, and that evidently caught your attention too, because that's how we connected. And I'm super, super glad to have met you, because everything that you say about the guest podcasting strategy that you've developed over time, I'm like, hallelujah. If I get more guests who do what you tell them to, I'm going to have an even better podcast. So I want to start by making it clear that you have something to offer. So I want to start by making it clear that you have something to offer people specifically if they go to your website. And why don't you tell us about that guide that you have developed?
Yeah, absolutely. And
why don't you tell us about that guide that you have developed?
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you hit a very important point there, DP. It's the fact that, this isn't just turn on a mic.
Get rid of that, tighten it up. Make him sound smart.
Very important point there, DP. It's the fact that this isn't just turn on a microphone, open your mouth, say something.
All right, you can hear some pixelizations, and I can't do anything about that. That's in the original recording, and I'm okay with it. I don't love it, but I'm also not going to pay for a service that can give me absolutely perfect NPR crystal clear audio because I'm cheap or I don't see the value. The fact that I can talk to Jason Zircone, who I think maybe he's in Pennsylvania or something, and I'm in Wisconsin, and we can do it free over free services. Got to say, I kind of love that, because if I were having to pay a lot of money to do this on top of the time, the blood, the sweat, the tears that it already entails, that would be another reason for me not to do it. So instead, I use these free services with equipment I already have to get a podcast that sounds as good as, let's say it's 90% of 90+% of sounding as good as something that comes out of Gimlet Media or NPR or Radiolab or something like that. I'm okay with that. If that means there's a little bit of pixelization in the audio every once in a while, that's the price of doing business when you don't want to pay for it. Right? Just saying. All right, back to this bad boy. So listen to this pixelization again.
I mean, you hit a very important point there, DP. It's the fact that this isn't just turn on a microphone, open your mouth, say some words, and at the end of the day, it all falls into place. There's a strategy to it, just like anything else. Excuse me. And what I was discovering is.
Okay, so, excuse me. And what I was discovering, let's see.
There's a strategy to it, just like anything else. What I was discovering is that people were going.
Is that what I was discovering was that people were going
into place. There's a strategy to it, just like anything else. What I was discovering is that people were going at it with more of a haphazard approach, and they may have a great microphone voice, and they may be very good at projecting themselves and telling their story to some degree. But in the long and short of it, what I was discovering was I felt like
he's good. Da do da da do da 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 da. There you can even see it. It's like gap da 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 gap da 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 gap. That, and I'm not picking on Jason. I'm just saying it gets a little rhythmic, and sometimes the best thing you can do is upset the rhythm so that it doesn't get too repetitive over time throughout the entire podcast, which gets boring.
Be very good at projecting themselves and telling their story to.
Okay, and telling their stories should be tightened up, right? And telling their stories. Let's leave a little bit of a gap.
They may be very good at projecting themselves and telling their story to some degree, but in the long and short of it, what I was.
But in the long and short of it, but in the long and short of it.
At projecting themselves and telling their story to some degree, but in the long and short of it, what I was discovering was I felt like what I could do is take
what I could do felt like what I could do.
Telling their story to some degree, but in the long and short of it, what I was discovering was I felt like what I could do is take some of the experiences that I've had, both from hosting podcasts, from producing podcasts. I've had both from hosting pod. It
sounds like both. Let's just get rid of it and see if it makes sense. Both hosting podcasts.
Take some of the experiences that I've had, both from hosting podcasts, from producing podcasts, and being a guest on podcasts, and teach others how to.
And teach others.
Podcasts and being a guest on podcasts, and teach others how to be the best possible podcast guest. And the result in that is that they'll win because they will be able to impact the audience they're speaking to. And if they have a strong call to action, that audience can then connect with them, learn more about what they do, and potentially become a customer. And even if they don't become a customer.
And even if they don't become a customer.
Become a customer. And even if they don't become a customer right away, they're now in the circle of influence. They can learn from you because you made an impact on them and provided value. At the same time, you're helping podcasters make better content. That's going to help them grow. That's going to help their show find more people. And it's just this very beautiful circle that keeps completing itself over and over, because the more people are optimized to be a good podcast guest, the more impact they can make, the better the content is for each show they appear on. And then that show can then in turn use that content to attract more listeners, because it's good content that people want to listen to and really learn from. So listen to and really learn.
So it's and really listen to.
Because it's good content that people want to listen to and really learn from. So I developed a podcast optimization guide that really addresses all of the items that you should be paying attention to as you get into podcast guest marketing. So it's sort of a boot camp, so to speak, but this guide is incredibly easy to read. I tried to add
Is
incredibly easy.
is just get rid of one of the ins.
It's sort of a boot camp, so to speak, but this guide is incredibly easy to read. I tried to add some entertainment to it as well, and it's gone through a few drafts and revisions ever since I handed it out to some people to check out just to get their feedback. But it ultimately has landed in a way that as you absorb this information, you can, with confidence, start looking for the right podcast to be on. And if you want to use a service like Podmatch, it's incredibly valuable. You can get connected with a lot of people that are doing very similar things to you. So you know that your mission and your message aligns with their content, which is one of the big factors that we talk about in the very beginning of the optimization guide. There's also many agencies out there that are always looking to help people get booked on the right podcasts. So if you're in a position where you're fully prepared, you understand what the expectations are, you're not going into this thinking, all right, podcast guest marketing,
I heard a breath.
All right, podcast guest.
Right there. I don't want to make his noise gate more sensitive, but I don't want that breath in there, because when I go through the compression phase where it actually does this to the audio, it's going to take the soft stuff and make it louder. That means if the breath is there, it's going to make the breath louder. I don't want that. So I'm cutting it out because I heard it and I could.
The expectations are, you're not going into this thinking, all right, podcast guest marketing, I'm just going to go on Joe Rogan's show and knock it out of the park and win. You can get over that real quick and start realizing that there's more value in the smaller audience riches in the niches as our
smaller audience. Let's see.
That there's more value in the smaller audience, riches in the niches as our.
I'm sorry.
You in the smaller audience, riches in the niches as our friend. Value in the smaller audience, riches in the niches as our friend Pat Flynn would say. And I know I've heard you reference that on your show before, DP.
Oh, yeah. Big fan of his.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Big fan of his.
And I know I've heard you reference that on your show before, DP.
Oh, yeah. Big fan of his.
Yeah. It's incredibly true, though. You can make more of an impact on a smaller, defined audience than you can going on a show that has this global reach, but it's very broad. It's not geared towards your mission and your message. So the optimization guide walks you through from start to finish.
That was kind of a walks you through from start to finish. It had a weird, I don't know if it was a half breath or something. Let's see if it sounds better this way.
So the optimization guide walks you through from start to finish. Here's what you need to know. Here's how you set up your goals. You build your plan of action. Here's how you start looking for the right podcasts. And these are things you should be looking for. Here's how you actually present yourself to that podcast versus just sending an email saying, hey, I'm really cool. You book me on the show.
We got some.
Hey, I'm really cool. You book me on.
I'm really ready to be on your show or something. I can't do anything about this, really. Let's see if it kind of makes sense contextually.
To that podcast versus just sending an email saying, hey, I'm really cool. You book me on the show. There's a method to the madness from start to finish. And that's really where I've put my eggs in this basket. I want to make sure that as podcasting continues to grow, the guests that are coming in to help podcasters make their content are fully optimized and ready to rock and roll when they turn on that microphone.
Well, and I think that's brilliant. Well, and see, you hear that? Well, and I think that's brilliant is what I want to say. Talking about. Whoa, what was that? I hit the looping thing. That went all the way back to the beginning. That was obnoxious. That's one of the weird quirks. If you hit the loop button, it'll go to the last loop you worked on, which is, I find annoying, Apple computers.
Help podcasters make their content are fully optimized and
all right, there was a podcasters.
And to help podcasters make their podcasters make
podcasters.
The guests that are coming in to help podcasters make their content are fully optimized and ready to rock and roll when they turn on that microphone.
Well, and I think that's let's see what this sounds like.
Rock and roll when they turn on that microphone.
And I think that's brilliant because I think that's okay. So I can go with the I right there. I think that's oh no, that's think. I want to cut. Let's see.
And ready to rock and roll when they turn on that microphone.
I think that's brilliant because there's podcasting is still a little bit wild. There's podcasting. I think I can get more I out of that. I think that's brilliant because podcasting is still a little bit Wild Westy when it comes to stuff. There are people trying all sorts of different things. And from the very beginning of my people trying all sorts of different things. And from the very beginning of my podcast, it's been unspoken, but I want that. It's been unspoken. From the very beginning of my podcast, it's been unspoken, but everyone understood. I don't charge you anything to be on my podcast. I don't. It's been unspoken, but everyone understood. I don't charge you anything to be on my podcast, and you don't charge me anything to be a guest on my podcast because it's a win-win. It's a mutual beneficial. It's a mutual beneficial. It's a mutual beneficial. Because it's a win-win. It's a mutual beneficial relationship. The funny thing is, I was just matched with somebody. I was just matched. The funny thing is, I was just matched with somebody, and it looked like their podcast was like perfect for me, to be honest. It was like perfect for me. I'm hitting the P's a little hard on my microphone because I think my mouth was too close to my microphone, which was creating the P's. Like right now, you can see my microphone is located below my chin and about that far apart, 4 fingers apart. So what is that? Maybe 6 inches? 5 to 6 inches? This is because the plosive power of my P's, ideally the P power is going over the top of my microphone. My mic is picking up the sound right under my chin, which here's a pro trick. Because I'm male and I have a baritone voice. By having it below here, it picks up a lot of that lower richness stuff. It's more chest voicey stuff than the higher end fricative. There's still plenty of articulation, but you get this nice kind of deeper voice. And again, because my chin is above my microphone, the real power from the P is coming straight out and not into the diaphragm of my microphone, which would pick it up as a popped P. And here, listen right now. Peter Pepper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Peter Pepper picked a peck of pickled peppers. If I hold my hand right over the microphone right here, Peter, I can feel the breeze go over the top of my fingers, but it's not going into my microphone, so it's not causing the diaphragm in there to freak out. But evidently, when I recorded this day, my chin was a lot closer to the center of the diaphragm of my microphone. Consequently, I'm getting some of that P picked up. And it looked like their podcast was like perfect for me to be on as a guest. And my value to them is, and my value to them, me to be on as a guest. And my value to them is that typically if we get along well, and just about every time we do, if we got along well, I need to leave the gap in there, but I heard I think a breath. Them is that typically if we get along well, and just about every time we do, and just about every time we do, to them is that typically if we get along well, and just about every time we do, I invite them on my podcast. There's kind of a quid pro quo understanding. Well, a quid pro quo understanding. There's kind of a quid pro quo understanding. Well, so they wanted me to fill out a form. So I don't need those in there. Need a longer gap because I'm setting up a story here. A quid pro quo understanding. They wanted me to fill out a form, which is not unusual. I don't make anyone fill out any form other than answer a couple of questions so I can have some stuff for my my episode notes. Stuff for my episode notes. So I can have some stuff for my episode notes. For my episode. For my episode notes. Questions so I can have some stuff for my episode notes. Let's focus. I can make that a little bit better. Stuff for my episode note. For my episode notes. Stuff for my episode note. Answer a couple of questions so I can have some stuff for my episode notes, like where people can follow you on Twitter, stuff like that. And that's all beneficial. Follow you on Twitter, stuff like that. And that's all. Follow you on Twitter, stuff like that. And that's all beneficial to you. So taking 2 seconds to fill that out shouldn't be a big part of your day. So I fill out this thing, and then down at the bottom is a thing that says, if you miss the recording session once it's scheduled, you will be billed $25 for a missed session. And I'm like, I have never seen that before. I certainly have never asked for that before. That's, to me, crazy, but what the heck? I'm not going to miss the session, so I'll go ahead and do that. I fill it out, and bing, 2 minutes later, in my email box is an invoice for $25. I'm like, we haven't even scheduled anything yet, and you're hitting me up for money? That is bogus. And so I have to ask you, because you're very experienced in the podcast space, can you talk about these issues about pay for play? Because there are pay for play podcasts. Mine isn't, yours isn't. But what should people expect if they want to become a guest? Is the first thing they do is get out a checkbook? Talking about. See, I accidentally hit the loop thing and I go right back to the front. I mean, Apple, do you know how many people? Okay. Truth be told, I am a huge Apple computer fan. Everything I have is Apple. I own Apple stock. I love the company. Apple, and I appreciate hugely that GarageBand is available free on any new Apple product you buy. I do appreciate that. But I know a ton of people use GarageBand for podcasting. You should be aware of that too, and I know you are, frankly. Why do you do stuff like I accidentally hit the loop button and all of a sudden it takes me totally off task to my last loop? Why do you do that? It's a user experience nightmare for podcasters. I would love it if you guys would devote some of your billions of dollars worth of profit to the development of GarageBand as a better platform for podcasters. Because believe me, that would be another lock-in for people like me. I hate the fact that I have to do a couple of things at the end of my processing of my podcast in another program. And all I do in that other program is add ID3 tags, compression, compress it, and then save it as a 192 kbps MP3. Now you're going to tell me, well, you can do the 193 kbps thing. Yeah, I know that. But I need to compress it first and compress the whole track. And I need to do it in a way that is optimized for podcast, not for music creation. There's a difference. Apple, I would love you even more. And this is a critique, not a criticism. I would love it if you spent a little bit more time going back to GarageBand to create it as a incredible experience for podcasters such as myself. Thank you in advance. Enough of the screed. Back to the show. So where were we? Like where people can follow you on Twitter, stuff like that. And that's all beneficial to you. So taking 2 seconds to fill that out shouldn't be a big part of your day. So I fill out this thing, and then down at the bottom is a thing that says, if you miss the recording session once it's scheduled, you will be billed $25 for a missed session. And I'm like, I have never seen that before. I certainly have never asked for that before. That's, to me, crazy, but what the heck? I'm not going to miss the session, so I'll go ahead and do that. I fill it out, and bing, 2 minutes later, in my email box is an invoice for $25. I'm like, we haven't even scheduled anything yet, and you're hitting me up for money? That is bogus. And so I have to ask you, because you're very experienced in the podcast space, can you talk about these issues about pay for play? Because there are pay for play podcasts. Mine isn't, yours isn't, but what should people expect if they want to become a guest? Is the first thing they do is get out a check? Yeah, that's where there was that kind of. What should people expect if they want to become a guest? Is the first thing they do is get out a check? People expect if they want to become a guest? Is the first thing they do is get out a checkbook?
It's become.
Is the first thing they do is get out a checkbook?
It's becoming more of a.
All right, tighten it up a little bit. First thing they do is get out a checkbook?
It's becoming more of a commonality. I mean, I know paywalls are becoming more of a thing. I mean, a lot more podcasts are asking for Patreon donations, things like that. I have seen some
There's a breath in there.
podcasts are asking for Patreon donations, things like that. I have seen some more quote unquote well-known shows. I mean, I don't think everyone is dropping quote unquote well-known shows. I mean, I don't think everyone
I mean, I don't think.
well-known shows. I mean, I don't think everyone is dropping the true size of their audience. And download numbers to me are true size of their audience. And download numbers to me are a flawed vanity metric, so I don't even want to bring that into the discussion. But I think it really depends on what they're using their podcast for. And in many cases, a lot of them are using it as a marketing tool, but they're going to use it as a way to generate content. Whether you feel the content of that show is something you want to pay for, look at it as a marketing investment if you're going to pay. In your case, DP, that is incredibly ballsy to say, if you miss the recording session, then you'll get billed $25. I have seen things like that. And I've seen it not so much with podcast interviews. I've seen it more with consultations, where if you have booked a consultation, then you don't show up and then say, oh, I missed it. I'm sorry. I want to reschedule. Then they'll say, okay, it's $25 to come on and talk with me now.
Come on and talk with me now. That can be tightened up. Again, I'm just kind of altering his rhythm a little bit so it doesn't get too sing-songy.
Sorry, I want to reschedule. Then they'll say, okay, it's $25 to come on and talk with me now. That I get to a degree. I've never seen it with podcasting, but then to then bill you anyway.
Yeah, to bill me in advance.
To then bill you anyway.
Yeah, to bill me in advance.
That is not, I mean, if I'm hearing you correctly, that's not what it said.
It wasn't.
Correctly, that's not what it said.
It wasn't.
So that is, to me, that is creating horrible upfront relationship.
Horrible upfront relationship.
That is creating horrible upfront relationship building. Upfront relationship building. And I mean, it's a complete mess. I would never feel. I'd almost feel like this is nothing more.
Yeah, I
mess. I would never. And I mean, it's a complete mess. Like I would never feel. I'd almost feel. And I mean, it's a complete mess. Like I would never feel. I'd almost feel like this is nothing more than a transaction to this person. We're not going to have a genuine conversation. I just want my money, even and $25 at that. That seems incredibly petty.
Well, and I was so kind of.
That seems incredibly petty.
I was so kind of cheesed off by
that. That seems incredibly petty.
I was so kind of cheesed off by that I contacted them. so kind of cheesed off by that I contacted them via the Podmatch, messaging system, and I was very calm about it. But I just said, in my 5 years of podcasting, I have never once been charged in advance for anything. In fact, I've never been charged for any guest spot on someone's show. I've never been charged for any guest spot on someone's show. I've never charged on my show. So this is incredibly off-putting. On my show. So this is incredibly off-putting. And the person came back and was calm and said, well, you know how when you go to a doctor and you miss an appointment, they'll charge you. And I just wanted to scream back and say, you're not a doctor.
You haven't missed the appointment yet. You haven't had
exactly. Give me a break. So I bring this up, and I wanted to have this conversation just because it hit me the wrong way. And I wanted to get your perspective because you're in a different part of the pod universe. And pod universe. You're in a different part of the pod universe. Your perspective because you're in a different part of the pod universe. And pod, universe. You're in a different part of the pod universe. And yeah, I know there are some pods that are charge pay for play. A lot of them have to do with authors. You got a new book, you pay to be on this thing where you've got a lot of people listening to find out about new books. Okay, I understand that. But that was not what we understand that. But that was not what we were talking about. I was talking about providing you a platform in my podcast to help you a platform in my podcast. See that little hickey in there? Get rid of the hickey. Talking about providing you a platform in my podcast to help boost your personal brand. And the quid pro quo was that you would provide me potentially a spot on your podcast to do the same thing. And by the way, if you decided after we had our podcast conversation that I wasn't right for your show, I'd be, okay, no harm, no foul, not a problem. Thanks a lot. Good luck with your podcast.
I think it's more of a standard now. I think it's more of a standard now to have a 15-minute discovery call before an actual interview takes place. In that call, you can determine if this person is a good fit for your show. I've done those myself.
I'm gonna listen to. Okay, I'm gonna loop this because I'm not sure.
For your show, I've done those myself. I've been a part of those as for your show. I've done those myself. I've been a part of those as for your show. I've done those myself. I've been a part of those as for your show. I've done those myself. I've been a part of those as for your show. I've done those myself. I've been a part of those as for your show.
It sounds better. The high cut was cutting out a little too much, I think.
In that call, you can determine if this person is a good fit for your show. I've done those myself. I've been a part of those as the oncoming guest. So it makes more sense to do that versus immediately thinking that someone is going to respond positively to a charge to be on that show. And at the end of the day, I think it comes down to, again, the value that you're going to get from being on that show. That they have an audience that's going to bring you hundreds of leads and expand your network and give you plenty of opportunities to grow and make money from that audience. If that's the case, $25 is a drop.
Get rid of that,
Make money from that audience. If that's the case, $25 is a drop in the bucket, but it's more.
See that little something right there? Let's see what that is.
Is a drop in the bucket, but it's more.
Okay, that's like a snort or something. So let's get rid of it and just do this.
$25 is a drop in the bucket, but it's more. To me, I mean, again, one of the big things I stress, and this isn't. To me, I mean. A drop in the bucket, but it's more. To me, I mean, again, one of the big things.
It's more to me.
Bucket, but it's more to me. I mean, again, one of the big things I.
Let's get. But to me,
case $25 is a drop in the bucket, but to me, I mean, again, one of the big things I stress, and this isn't just with the podcast guest optimization. This is just everything I do. It's communication. If you're not communicating effectively, then you're not going to win, and
then you're not going to win, and then you're not going to win
effectively. Then you're not going to win, and podcasting is all about effective communication. And I've talked to people that I just wonder.
I just wonder.
Effective communication. And I've talked to people that have effective communication.
So there's a gap in there. See, I can get that out of there. Highlight both of these segments so they both move. That's a mistake if you don't highlight everything
about effective
that needs to move.
Effective communication. And I've talked to people that I just wonder how they've gotten this far.
There's an extra how in there. I just wonder how.
I just wonder how they've gotten as far as they have.
Yeah.
How they've gotten as far as. The people that I just wonder how they've gotten as far as they have.
Yeah. I know. I know.
Whatsoever.
Yeah, I know. All right, so that got stepped on. So
how they've gotten as far as they have.
Yeah. Goes up there. Come on, what are you doing? There we go.
About effective communication. And I've talked to people that I just wonder how they've gotten as far as they have.
Yeah, I oh, come on. Tighten that up.
Effective communication. And I've talked to people that I just wonder how they've gotten as far as they have.
Yeah, I know exactly, because after this interaction, I'm like, not only Yeah, I know exactly, because after this interaction, I'm like, not only will I not pay your after this interaction, I'm like, not only will I not pay your $25, I don't want to be on your podcast. And if I run across anyone who's ever mentioned your name, I won't speak poorly about you. I'll just tell the truth about what you did and allow them to decide whether, are you kidding? Speak poorly about you. I'll just tell the truth about what you did and allow them to decide whether, are you kidding me? You know, because the fact is, I don't need that, I can keep, because the fact is, and allow them to decide whether, are you kidding me? Because the fact is, everything you do in life says something about you as a brand. Everything you do in life says something about you as a brand. It literally goes into your brand suitcase. And you can have the most beautiful brand handle or brandle in the world that describes you as a whatever you are that is so attractive to other people. But your suitcase has all those other things in there. Things like, yeah, I charge people to be on my podcast. And when they question the charge, I then say, oh, if you need it waived, I'll waive it for you. And I'm like, you're implying I'll waive it for you. And I'm like, you're implying that I need it waived as opposed to that it's I'll waive it for you. And I'm like, you're implying that I need it waived as opposed to that it's inappropriate for you to even ask for this? Am I insane here?
Yeah,
And I guess I want to underline that for listeners, which is if you choose to make guesting on podcasts part if you choose to make guesting on podcasts part of your personal brand building strategy, understand as part of your personal brand building strategy, understand asking for money to be on a podcast is very asking for money to be on a podcast to be on a podcast to okay. This is confusing me. Asking for money to be on a podcast is very rare. And when I say that, I'll bring up I'll bring up one of the guests I've had. And when I say that, I'll bring up when I say that, I'll bring up one of the guests I've had on recently. And when I say that, I'll bring up one of the guests I've had on recently, a young man from Singapore named Rayson Chu, who got Gary Vaynerchuk on his podcast, even though he's a young guy in Singapore. Do you think Gary Vaynerchuk asked for in Singapore? Do you think Gary Vaynerchuk asked for money to be on the podcast, or that Rayson Chu asked him to pay to be on his podcast? No. But here's the thing. Gary Vaynerchuk got to be Gary Vaynerchuk by saying yes, even to small by saying yes. Here's a pro tip. If as a host you misspeak, stop and say it again. Because if you're editing it, you can edit it out. Edit the bad take out. Gary Vaynerchuk got to be Gary Vaynerchuk by saying yes, even to small podcasters all the way on the other side of the world. And I know why he did it. Because Gary Vaynerchuk probably said, you know what? I don't know how big my audience is in Singapore. If this guy can help me get more interest in Singapore, Singapore is the financial hub of Southeast Asia. If I can get over there and start meeting more people in Southeast Asia, you can see the strategy at play, which is if Racing knows 50. You can see the strategy at play, Asia. You can see, get rid of that. Yeah. Move, just tighten it up a little bit. Over there and start meeting more people in Southeast Asia. You can see the strategy at play, which is if Racing knows 50 key people in Singapore, he's worth more to me than someone who has 50,000 Americans. Why? Because 50,000 Americans already have heard of me or can find out about me very easily. But if you met 50 key, if you met, but if you met, dang it. Find out about me very easily. But if you met 50 key people in Singapore, that's where it goes back to what you were saying earlier about having small audiences be perhaps even more effective for you because they are so tight, because they are so connected, and they are so personally interactive. If you're one of 5 million, you're basically nobody to nobody. If you're one with 50, and all 50 like you, you write your own ticket over time, you know? But anyway, bottom line, podcast, you want to be a guest, don't pay and don't ask to be paid.
Yeah, I would say...
Don't pay and don't ask to be paid.
Yeah, I would say, the only time that I would pay is A, if they were upfront about how and why, and B, I felt like it was a meaningful investment that was going to help me. If my appearance was going to go, I can know Entrepreneurs on Fire. Go. I can know.
Okay, breath in there. Get rid of it.
If my appearance was going to go, I can know Entrepreneurs on Fire. It is a $35 appearance fee. That show has 500,000 downloads a month.
Yeah.
So if you look at that and say, okay, this audience is going to resonate with my message, it makes sense for me to make this investment. Then by all means, make that investment. But if it's something that's ticky-tack like that, like $25 coming at you that you didn't even expect, that's a totally different story. And that to me is...
All right, we got to kill the music bit down here.
Is more of a communication issue than it is a ridiculous fee issue, although it is a ridiculous fee.
Well, we got a well here. Well, it left a bad taste in my mouth, and consequently, that personal brand is dead to me.
There you go.
But I will tell you, this personal taste in my mouth, and consequently, that personal brand is dead to me. But I will tell you, this personal brand is certainly not, because Jason and I had a great talk on his Evolution of Brand podcast, which I don't know if it's come out yet, I don't know if it's... Get rid of the ums. It's kind of it makes total sense. Why have I just figured this out? I've always said that ums make you sound like you don't know what you're talking about. And I know it's perhaps a little politically incorrect to say ums make you sound dumb, but there's a reason that and dumb sound the same way. Literally, if you're an ummer, you sound dumber. Take that for what it's worth, which is not all that much, but it's true. Take out those ums, you instantly sound smarter. On his Evolution of Brand podcast, which I don't know if it's come out yet, but if it hasn't, check it out. Check out Evolution of Brand, because you'll get a lot more Jason goodness on it. And also search for the episode where Jason... And Ah, dang it. I don't know why this does this. Maybe I need to update GarageBand. Maybe I'll check that out because you'll get a lot more Jason goodness on it. And also search for the episode where Jason and I talk because I really enjoyed it. And I think that the listeners of the Nonfiction Brand podcast will get a lot out of it. But evolution of brand is not the only pod thing you've got going. What else do you have going on in the podcasting space? In the podcasting space. That sounded weird. Space. The Final Frontier. Space. I think I just got one of those weird pixelization gaps in here. So let's see if tightening up makes it sound a little better. In the podcasting space. Yeah, it does. Let me say that again. Oh, good. I said it again. Let me say that again. What else do you have going? Is not the only pod thing you've got going. What else? Let's see if this. But evolution of brand is not the only pod thing you've got going. What else do you have going on in the podcast? Got going. What else? Brand is not the only pod thing you've got going. What else do you have going on in the podcasting space? Command T. Bim down. Command Z is our friend. When in doubt, hit Command Z to undo. What else do you have going on in the podcasting space?
Evolution of Brand is my podcast that allows me to have just absolute tremendous conversations with, and is my podcast that allows me to have absolute tremendous conversations with professionals and entrepreneurs from all over the globe. And that's been my favorite aspect. And it's funny how things escalate as you get rolling. When I first started, I mean, I took a year to really plan out what I wanted this show to be. And when it finally started coming to fruition, started coming to fruition to where everything was in place, I had identified my ideal listener, I had built all the graphics, I knew the format, I knew what I wanted to do, and I started reaching out to get guests on. I started meeting new people. I started meeting people that then introduced me to other new people. And it's just been a wild ride. And the conversations that I've got to have, for me personally, that is enough to keep the podcast going. And I know that many people get into a funk with their podcast because they just don't see the numbers they were expecting. And, I don't have enough downloads and no one
breath.
And, I don't have enough downloads and no one see the numbers they were expecting. And, I don't have enough downloads and no one's listening to this. And why is this just so bad? And I'm putting so much time into this. And that's where, from a guesting perspective, from a producing perspective, you have to go square one and you have to define why you're doing this from the start. If you don't have a mission in mind with your podcast or even with your guesting efforts, you're going to fail. Your podcast as a podcaster will go away because you will eventually keep deprioritizing it to a point to where it becomes nothing but a sunken rock in the ocean. And that's why there's so many podcasts out there. And that's where I say, if you start a podcast, you need to start something that you're passionate about, that you can talk about when no one's listening. If you were sitting in a room by yourself, you could still talk about it and you'd still have fun doing it. Because the reality is, in the beginning, that's how it is. You have to build your audience. Yeah. And that was how, and I was able to get to that point through 6 years of podcasting experience, through other shows that I'd attempted that I did lose my passion for. So I moved away, and that's when I started, I took these lessons and I threw it all and made this amalgam with evolution of brand. This is what I want. This is what I know, and this is how I want to do it. And it's been, no, I haven't regretted a second of it. And that's my big recommendation to.
And that's my big recommendation. That can be tighter. And that's my big recommendation.
And that's my big recommendation to podcasters out there. When you're starting a show, make sure it's a topic that you can remain passionate about and value the conversations.
And value the conversations. And you can see how much V there is, the kind of ramp up in the V.
Passionate about and value the conversations you're having over everything else. You just created a platform where someone else who shares your interests and shares your passions is agreeing to come on with you and talk about them for half an hour, for 45 minutes, for 1 hour, whatever. That's awesome. You get to talk about your passion for an hour and then put it into a format that goes globally. And it may not get discovered by the globe today, but it could get discovered by the globe next week, next month, next year. That's the beauty of evergreen content. Think of podcasting in that perspective, and you're going to be a lot more successful. So your original question, DP, I feel like I've ventured off the path, but evolution of brand was built in that framework. And that's how I continue to roll out new episodes every Tuesday. And then I do a recap episode every Friday where I'll add in a little tip or strategy or whatever. It's like, I think I've had a couple Black Friday rants about why I hate Black Friday and things like that in the past. I mean, there's been all kinds of different things I talk about. And then I'll give a sneak preview of the next episode too. So every week I've got 2 episodes coming out. The conversation episode on Tuesday is always a little bit longer. The recaps usually anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes. And that is my way of connecting. And that is
okay. That kind of that. Let's see.
Anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes. And that is my way of connecting and networking and meeting new people and having great conversations. And that's stemmed into what I'm doing with podcast guest marketing and the whole optimization angle that I've put on this. I realized that as I got into angle that I've put on this, I realized that as I got into the world and started helping people get booked on podcasts, I started seeing how that side of things worked. I met a lot of people that are in that space. And what I realized was there's a lot of agencies that are helping people do this. I'm glad to be a part of it, but I want to do more. I want to help them understand this platform a little bit more. And that was where I looked at, okay, what can we do to make podcasts as a whole better? Hosts obviously need to focus on sound quality, focus on their overall production, focus on asking good questions and having meaningful conversations. The guests can come in and play a huge role in that. They just need to understand why and understand how and understand what they can accomplish from that. So I felt that providing that value is much more impactful than just being someone that helps them get booked on podcasts. Because as we know, we've talked about Podmatch as we've talked today, DP. Incredible service. And there's a lot of services out there like that. I feel I'm a big fan of Podmatch. That's one I'm personally involved with. But I know there's a lot of agencies out there helping too. And my goal is to help them have an easier job.
Help them.
My goal is to help them.
See, it's nice and clean. It's easy to get rid of because he's got a good signal.
And my goal is to help them have an easier job.
My goal is to.
And my goal is to help them have an easier job.
Okay, the 2 is right. 2. Oh, come on. And my goal is to help them have an easier job, because if people can come to them with a better understanding of what they want to accomplish, that's going to help them find the right shows for them. And then goes back to the beginning.
everybody wins because the content is better, because everybody's more prepared and has a better understanding of what they can achieve.
Yeah.
And has a better understanding of what they can achieve.
Yeah, well, that's all great. And, the stuff you share is so wonderful. I understand that you've got well, number one, we're coming to the end of this week's episode, but don't worry, Jason's going to be back with me again next week. But before we go, Jason, I understand that you have a guide that's available for people to download that can get them started. I hate to use the word journey because everybody does, but to get them started developing a podcast guest strategy that can work for them. Where can listeners of the Nonfiction Brand podcast go to get that guide? Oh, come on. Be good to me. Be good to me. Where can listeners of the Nonfiction Brand podcast go to get that guide?
I put together a blueprint for podcast guest optimization that walks you through all of the steps to understanding what optimization that walks you through all of the steps to understanding what to expect from for podcast guest optimization that walks you through all of the steps to understanding what to expect from the network all the way up through getting booked and how to analyze your interviews and get results from those interviews. So the best place to visit is jasonsircone.com/nonfiction brand. And when you go there, you can connect with me on social media, but you can also get access to my free guide, which is called Guest Theory: 10 tips for becoming a valuable, fully optimized podcast guest. So check out that page and you will get everything you need in regards to understanding what podcast optimization is, or I should say podcast guest optimization is, and how you can develop a winning podcast guest marketing campaign.
Oh man, you got to go, people. Oh man, you got to go, people. You got to go, people. Get rid of the I like the oh man, you got to go, people. I don't know why this sliding doesn't always work. Oh man, you got to go, people. You got to go to jasonsircone.com/nonfiction brand. Ooh, I love that vanity URL because it's definitely worth it. And by the way, because it's definitely worth it. Because ooh, I love that vanity URL because it's definitely worth it. And by the way, I've actually taken a look at the guide and it is packed with information, practical information. I won't call it theoretical information, but when I say practical, I mean what type of microphone. Practical information. I won't call it theoretical information, but when I say practical, I mean. I won't call it theoretical information, but when I say practical, I mean information. I won't call it theoretical information, but when I say practical, I mean what type of microphone would be right, or what type of technology do I need to have? Can I do this from various platforms ranging from a smartphone to how much of a studio setup do I need to have? And the answers will frankly surprise you because especially with smartphones these days, the sound quality can be pretty darn good. But anyway, the guide looks at all that stuff. And again, you can find that at jasoncercone.com/nonfictionbrand. Cercone is spelled Cercone. As someone who very carefully spells his last name every single day, I appreciate people, especially on podcasts, who spell out last names like Cercone. Anyway, Jason, thank you so much for being on this episode of the Nonfiction Brand Podcast. We'll be back together again next week. But before people leave, I would love for you to like, subscribe, refer this podcast to others, and review it, because that really helps other people find it. Until next week, I'm DP Knudten, your host, and he is
Jason Cercone.
And I'll be talking at you again next week. All right, get rid of that damn loopy thing. Get rid of the damn thing. DP Knudten, your host, and he is
Jason Cercone.
And we'll be talking at... Tighten it up a little bit. Your host, and he is
Jason Cercone.
And we'll be talking at you again next week. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. That's just a nice period on the end of that. So, okay. So what's happening now? I got to save this bad boy because he's going to be on next week. Excuse me. And in order to do that, I need to go to my podcast where I've got the Jason Cercone. You can see I've got the original GarageBand file there and also the clip file, which we won't deal with today. And all I'm going to do is make sure I'm on the folder and go Command D for duplicate. And bingo, I've got right there a copy of it, an exact copy of it, complete with the band files. Why do I do that? Because that will be what I use for next week's episode. Everything's copied, all the settings from that I've messed with, all the little minor changes I've made with this week, they'll be in next week's file already, so I won't have to mess with the noise gate. I won't have to mess with the EQ settings. All that's all figured out. Yay, I can save some time simply by using this week's band file, BAND file, which is the file format for GarageBand. And I'll be all ready to go next week. Yay, just makes it that much easier. However, I do need to do a few more things in here to finish this. Number one would be getting rid of this, which is next week's episode part. That's my bye-bye right there. I'm going to take the live area thing, which Apple, again, they hide it all the way back here under this thing. Really bad user experience, guys. But you can see right here, that's the end marker. I need to move the end marker just toward the end of my podcast, like right there. I do know this. I'm going to take, and you can see how short last week's episode was compared to this one. We had a great conversation. I don't like cutting it short. This is my outro music. I call it Nonfiction Funk. Which, by the way, I made this music in GarageBand myself. So once again, cheap-ass rat bastard that I am, I found a way to do it for free and do it yourself. Here's the problem. As I said before, I'm a lazy perfectionist. DP got to DIY. DP's got to do it himself. And consequently, that's what I'm doing right now, including the creation of the music, which I'll play for you in a sec, but I want to kind of get things figured out timing-wise, because you can see the music comes in. I think I'm plenty loud there, but I'm going to bring this up because it's going to be fighting the music a little bit. Same thing with Jason saying his name, so we'll go Next week, I'm DP Knudten, your host, and he is
Jason Sircone.
And we'll be talking at you again next week. Bye-bye. All right, so that's cool. Let's start bringing this up a little bit. So you can see I'm matching the kind of rise in the music. People leave, I would love for you to like, subscribe, refer this podcast to others, and review it, because that really helps other people find it. Until next week, I'm DP Knudten, your host, and he is
Jason Sircone.
And we'll be talking at you again next week. Bye-bye. All right, I just want to check. My EQ is probably, vintage vocal, same as his. Again, male voices, that's a great one to go with, just to get a little bit of richness, that kind of low-end richness that makes you sound so manly. It's all about sounding manly. All right, so let's get rid of that. I am going to save this by sharing, going under the share navigation up at the top of GarageBand. You'll see export song to disk. It'll ask me where I want it to go. I need to make sure it's going to the right file folder, and it is episode 190, making sure it's not the copied one. Nope, it's the right one. I'm going to save it as an AIFF, uncompressed 16-bit CD quality file, and I just hit export. And this will take a little bit as it processes through. What I'm doing now is I'm bouncing. It's called bouncing. I'm bouncing it out of GarageBand into a form that other applications can use. An AIFF file, which is a lossless audio file, meaning it hasn't been compressed. It's the best quality I can possibly get. I'm then going to open that up in another program called Audacity, which I'll show you in just a second, to do a few more things that GarageBand can't do, which drives me a little bit crazy. Because, frankly, I would love to do it all in GarageBand, but there are some things that GarageBand doesn't do that I need to do in Audacity. So, again, you can see the entire file is being processed. It's bouncing, as you can see the word bouncing. That's what it's called. I'm bouncing the file out of GarageBand so that it can be used by other applications. So let's just watch it as it does this for a second. Yeah, fascinating, riveting live streaming brought to you by DP Knudten. Okay, we're normalizing. Boom, we're out of here. I am going to go ahead and close out of GarageBand. But over here, I'm going to make sure I'm in the right file folder. And so I don't confuse myself. I'm going to go to this AIFF file, or AIF is the suffix, .faif. You can see it gives me a date and time, which is somewhat helpful. Yeah, it is. But now I'm going to right-click on this to reveal Open with, ding, 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 Audacity. Now, again, I choose to use Audacity, which is spelled like that, and that's its logo, because this is a free software program that is also cross-platform, meaning that it works on Apple, Mac OS, Windows, and also Linux. So if you got 3 platforms there, which is awfully nice. So you can see the file here. I've got something weird going here with a peak, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to hit Command A to highlight everything, and I'm going to go under the Effect navigation at the top of Audacity and go down to Compressor. These settings I have never touched. Literally, the first time I used Audacity to compress the file, I thought, let's see what happens if I don't mess with anything. They did this for a reason. I'm going to find out what that reason is. And so I just hit OK and watch what happens. It's going to think its way through the entire AIFF file and compress it. And what that does is bring down the highs, bring up the lows so that it's boom. You can see what happened. Again, Command Z, this is where it was. This is Command Shift Z to redo. This is after compression. See what I mean? Before compression, after compression. All of a sudden, the quieter parts are louder, and the louder parts are, it's like panini pressing a little bit. That's the way I think of it. Okay, the other thing that I do is under the effect navigation, you'll see right here, loudness normalization. When I hit this, you will see normalize perceived loudness to -16 LUFS. Now, one of these days I'm going to look up what LUFS actually stands for, but I think it means loudness units blah, blah, blah standard or something like that, because this is the standard at which you should make sure that your file goes out, because when I post this up on podbean.com, the podcast host that I use, it will go out to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I need to make sure that it goes out at the level you expect to hear it, rather than being recorded too quietly or too loud. This is the way to do this. So treat mono as dual mono recommended. I'm not touching that. I'm going to hit OK and watch what happens. It looks at the file and then does this, which is boop. It just drops it a little bit. Again, before, that's compression. This is what compression looks like. Oh, let me say that again. Pre-compression AIFF file, compressed AIFF file, loudness normalized AIFF file. Believe me, not a big difference, but it makes such a quality difference. Now, the final thing I'm going to do. Under Audacity, File, Export. Export as MP3. Again, this is compressing the file in terms of file size and quality. A lot of people will do their podcasts compressing to, hold on, let me get to the right folder. They'll compress it at 128 because you've got all these settings, right? A lot of people will do a podcast at 128 kbps. I personally can hear a difference all the way to 192. Now, if you can go higher, but frankly, after 192, I can't hear a difference in terms of quality. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to hit save, make sure it's in the right folder, save. And this is the other thing I love about Audacity. It allows me to do metadata tags, or what are called ID3 tags. These tags actually go in the file itself and help identify it via however you want to identify it. So I'm going to load some saved settings. Well, before I do that, I can hand fill in these fields, right? All I want. Or I can load my podcast file, and all I need to do is update the number of episode that it is, track number. That's where I put the episode number. I've got all this stuff, including blah, 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 yada, yada, ding dong. Now I save this for next week over itself. So I'm overwriting the file so that next week it will say episode 190, which I will then update to 191. Now I am going to hit OK. And it's going through the entire file and compressing it. Now that's different. Audio compression is about this, making the volume levels a little bit more consistent and even from the loudest parts to the softest parts. This is about file compression. It's taking a 32 megabyte file and turning it into, we'll check the numbers, but let me get through this. I'm going to hide this so we can actually see. So the AIFF file, wow, the AIF file is 356.2 megabytes in size. When I compressed file size into an MP3 and packaged it for uploading to my podcast host, it is now 48.4 megabytes. Do you see a difference? Yeah, you go from lossless CD quality to audio quality that's appropriate for a podcast, and you drop a ton of weight. That's why you do that. Now, I'm going to get rid of the date and timey crap, because this is, and I'm going to listen through this, but let's just do this. What's today's talking about? Well, it's actually another live edition recording session of the Nonfiction Brand podcast with a very special guest. And I want to introduce you to that very special guest in just a second. But I do want to say that the key thing to take away from this conversation today, I mean, there are going to be a ton of takeaways, believe me. But one of the big ones is podcasting is not just a good strategy for people who podcast themselves, host their own podcast, but it's a really great strategy for people who want to guest on podcasts. But perhaps, so we don't obviously need to listen to that whole thing now, but I will listen to the whole thing now because that's part of my quality control. I listen to the whole thing, look for things. And the funny thing is, there have been times where I'm like, do I really need to check it? No. And then that kind of back of your neck thing of going, if you don't listen to it, something's going to be wrong. So I listen to it and I find something incorrect. Or I've found things like gaps that are like, how did that even happen? So it's always incumbent upon any good podcaster to actually listen through the entire thing before you post it to your podcast host. So I'm going to do that, and you don't need to watch me listening. So instead, I'm going to sign off for now for this week's episode of IMNSHOW, my Not So Humble Opinion show, which allows me to do a number of different things, including exactly what I did today, edit a new episode of Nonfiction Brand Live for next Monday's release. And again, if you're interested in checking out the Nonfiction Brand podcast, all you have to do is go to whatever podcast app you use and do a search for Nonfiction Brand. You're going to see this image minus the word live, and that's how you know you got the right thing. That is the Nonfiction Brand podcast, which comes out every single Monday, as it has for 189 times this week. And Monday will be episode 190. So definitely check that out. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something, because the main thing you should take away is that podcasting is a tremendous opportunity to demonstrate who you are, what you do, and how you do it, because you've just watched me demonstrate who I am, what I do, and how I do it by being face-to-face with you. Is there a better way to get an idea of who someone actually is than to see their face as they do boring stuff like editing a podcast? That the person you see before you right now is the person that you would see right in front of you if were we to ever meet in person. And frankly, someday I hope we do. Until then, I'm going to say that's it for this episode of IMNSHOW. I'll be back next week on Saturday, most likely, to edit next week's episode. Check out the Nonfiction Brand podcast. Comes out Monday. Until then, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.